Daily Dose Biographies presents The American Presidents. George Washington. Born in 1732 Virginia, George Washington was homeschooled by tutors on the family plantation until his father passed away when George was only 11. The family's loss forced Washington to assist in the management of the plantation until his adept math skills landed him a job as a surveyor in his teen years, which earned him enough money to buy land of his own. When his half-brother and mentor Lawrence Washington passed away in 1752, George inherited Lawrence's Mount Vernon estate along the Potomac River, which would become his home for the remainder of his life. That same year, despite a complete lack of military experience, Washington was made Commander-in-Chief of the Virginia Militia due to his uncanny leadership skills during the French and Indian War, which saw 2 horses shot out from under him before returning to Mount Vernon with 4 near-miss bullet holes in his overcoat. After resigning his commission to grow Mount Vernon from 2,000 acres into an 8,000-acre mega-complex of 5 working farms, in 1759, Washington married wealthy widow Martha Dandridge Custis before his election to the Virginia House of Burgesses that same year. His growing skills as a statesman made him a delegate to the First and Second Continental Congress, and after war broke out between the young Republic and Great Britain, Washington was named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, where he inspired patriot forces despite overwhelming odds against the largest superpower of the day. After 8 grueling years of war, Washington's performance at the Battle of Yorktown, the last major engagement of the Revolutionary War, made him a national hero to a war-weary yet victorious young nation. Combined with his impressive leadership skills during the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Washington was elected the first American president in 1789, serving 2 terms that saw the ratification of 5 new states into the Union. During his lifetime, George Washington suffered a dizzying array of illnesses, including smallpox, repeated bouts of malaria, tuberculosis, dysentery, and multiple infections and abscesses with recurrent high fevers. In December of 1799, Washington caught a cold while inspecting his properties in the rain, which soon worsened into a throat infection that took his life on December 14, 1799. At the time of his death, Washington owned over 300 slaves, yet due to his growing opposition to slavery in his later years, by order of his last will and testament, his slaves were freed after his wife's death in 1802, making George Washington one of the most recognized men in American history. Thomas Jefferson. After graduating from the College of William and Mary in 1762, Thomas Jefferson studied law under Virginia attorney George Wythe before opening his own practice in 1767. Well respected from an early age, from 1769 to 1775, Jefferson became a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, later renamed the Virginia House of Delegates after independence from Great Britain. Inheriting land near Charlottesville, Virginia, Jefferson's keen interest in architecture and gardening led to the construction of his beloved Monticello, or Little Mountain in the Italian, where he and his young wife Martha gave birth to 6 children before Martha's untimely death at the tender age of 33. While only 2 of their children would survive into adulthood, Jefferson was so devastated by the loss of his beloved wife that he would never marry again. As war broke out with Great Britain, in 1775, Jefferson was selected as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, where he penned the first draft of the Declaration of Independence at 33 years of age, resigning the following year when he was re-elected to the Virginia House of Delegates. From 1779 to 1781, Jefferson served as governor of Virginia before landing his second stint in Congress from 1783 to 1784. A year later, Jefferson succeeded Benjamin Franklin as U.S. Minister to France, and upon his return to the States in 1789, President George Washington appointed him as the nation's first Secretary of State, where he frequently bucked heads with Secretary of the Treasury and staunch big government Federalist Alexander Hamilton over foreign affairs, interpretations of the Constitution, and the size and authority of the federal government. Hamilton's insistence on a strong federal government would lead Jefferson to co-found the Democratic-Republican Party, which was an ideological precursor of today's Republican Party. In the presidential election of 1796, Jefferson defeated John Adams for the office of vice president, later running a second time against Adams for president during the election of 1800, which proved to be a bitter fight between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, just a few short years after both political sides had been so united in their revolutionary calls for independence. The crowning achievement of Jefferson's first term was his successful orchestration of the Louisiana Purchase from France, followed by Lewis and Clark's expedition into the newly purchased lands, an 8,000-mile journey which took them to the Pacific Ocean and back. Handily re-elected in 1804, Jefferson's second-term focus was to steer the United States safely away from involvement in the Napoleonic Wars of 1803 to 1815, which at one point or another dragged much of Europe into the conflict. After turning down a third term as president, Jefferson returned home to his beloved Monticello, where he continued to pursue his interest in architecture, music, reading, and gardening, at the same time helping to found the University of Virginia, which opened its doors for its first student body in 1825. After his death on July 4, 1826, 50 years to the day after he signed the Declaration of Independence, his surviving estate was heavily mired in debt due to a lifetime of extravagant spending, which in turn required that his slaves be sold at auction alongside his land holdings, art, and furnishings, forever cementing Thomas Jefferson into the early history of a newly formed nation. John Quincy Adams. Born in 1767, Massachusetts, the first son of John and Abigail Adams, as a boy, John Quincy Adams witnessed the 1775 Battle of Bunker Hill from a rise near his family's farm, later achieving proficiency in 7 foreign languages while studying at several European universities. Completing his education at Harvard, Adams studied law before his admittance to the bar in 1790, setting up a law practice in Boston before his election to the Massachusetts State Senate, followed by the U.S. Senate in 1803. Growing ever more estranged from the Federalist Party, Adams resigned his Senate seat in 1808 to join the faculty at Harvard as a full professor. A year later, President James Madison appointed Adams ambassador to the Russian court of Tsar Alexander I, where he witnessed Napoleon's invasion and subsequent retreat from Russia, an event which resulted in the near destruction of Napoleon's Grand Army and the deaths of some 380,000 French soldiers. After the War of 1812 resulted in an American victory over Great Britain's attempted aggression, in 1814, Madison sent Adams to Belgium, where he negotiated the war-ending Treaty of Ghent. 3 years later, President James Monroe named Adams his Secretary of State, where he negotiated the joint occupation of Oregon with England and the acquisition of Florida from Spain, followed by his role as chief architect behind the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which warned European powers against further colonization in the Western Hemisphere. Winning the White House in 1824, after a 5-way presidential race was decided by the House of Representatives, something Andrew Jackson supporters called a corrupt bargain, Adams' one-term presidency would be largely stymied by Jacksonian Democrats in Congress, and while his bid for a second term was marred by accusations of corruption and steady pushback against his unpopular domestic programs, including federal funding of an interstate road and canal system and his staunch opposition to slavery, John Quincy Adams, like his father before him, became the second president in U.S. history who failed to win a second term. Losing to Andrew Jackson in the election of 1828, Adams spent the remainder of his life as a congressman from Massachusetts in the U.S. House of Representatives, earning the nickname Old Man Eloquent before passing away following back-to-back strokes on February 23, 1848, forever cementing John Quincy Adams into the annals of American politics. Martin Van Buren. Born in 1782, Kinderhook, New York, Martin Van Buren apprenticed as an attorney before opening his own private practice in 1803. Subscribing to the political theories of Thomas Jefferson, who favored states' rights over a strong federal government, Van Buren served 2 terms in the New York State Senate, divided by a stint as State Attorney General, before winning a seat in the U.S. Senate in 1821, where he founded a state political organization known as the Albany Regency. After John Quincy Adams won the White House in the presidential election of 1824, Van Buren helped form a coalition of Jeffersonian Republicans who backed Andrew Jackson in the presidential election of 1828, which soon emerged as the Democratic Party. Departing the Senate that same year, Van Buren successfully ran for governor of New York before resigning from office when newly elected President Jackson appointed Van Buren as his Secretary of State. Resigning his cabinet post in 1831, Van Buren served as minister to Great Britain before earning a spot as Jackson's running mate during the presidential election cycle of 1832, where they swept both the popular and electoral vote over Whig Party opposition candidate Henry Clay. Winning the White House himself in the presidential election of 1836 against Whig Party upstart William Henry Harrison, Van Buren took office just in time for the Panic of 1837, which collapsed banks and much of the American economy after federal funds were transferred to state banks from the now-defunct Bank of the United States. After Van Buren's deflationary monetary policies failed to improve the economy, his push for the establishment of an independent federal treasury drove many conservative Democrats into the Whig Party, which in turn handed the White House to Harrison in the presidential election of 1840. Running again in 1844, his refusal to endorse the annexation of Texas led Southern Democrats to elect James K. Polk before Van Buren's final political defeat as the Free Soil candidate during the presidential election of 1848. Losing handily to Zachary Taylor, Van Buren retired to Kinderhook to write his autobiography, which proved to be a valuable primer into the politics of the era. He died on July 24, 1862, a little more than 3 months after the outbreak of Civil War, making the life and public service of Martin Van Buren an age-defining politician during the years leading up to war. James Buchanan. Born in 1791 Cove Gap, Pennsylvania, James Buchanan opened a successful law practice in 1812 before serving in the Pennsylvania legislature as a member of the Federalist Party. Elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1820, over the next decade of service, Buchanan flipped to the Democratic Party following the dissolution of the Federalist Party. Appointed ambassador to Russia in 1831 by President Andrew Jackson. Returning to the States 2 years later, in 1834, Buchanan was elected to the U.S. Senate for the state of Pennsylvania, holding office for the next 11 years, until he resigned his seat to become President James Polk's Secretary of State, helping to expand the nation's territory by 1/3, thanks to the annexation of Texas and much of the present-day American Southwest, following the defeat of Mexico during the Mexican-American War. After serving as minister to Great Britain during the presidency of Franklin Pierce, by the time Buchanan ran for president in 1856, the country by then had grown deeply divided over the issue of slavery, and while his primary Republican challenger, John Fremont, asserted that the federal government should ban slavery in all U.S. states and territories, Buchanan won the White House on a more moderate platform that the issue of slavery should be decided by individual states and territories. The only bachelor to hold the office of U.S. President, Buchanan earned his nickname 10-Cent Jimmy by his Republican opponents after Buchanan maintained during his presidential campaign that 10 cents was a fair daily wage for manual laborers. The issue of slavery in America came to a head 2 days after Buchanan was sworn into office, when the Supreme Court handed down its Dred Scott decision, ruling that the federal government had no regulatory power over the issue of slavery, at the same time denying African Americans, free or enslaved, the rights of citizenship. Tensions between the abolitionist North and the slaveholding South worsened with Buchanan's support of the Lecompton Constitution, which would have allowed Kansas to become a slave state, while in October of 1859, John Brown's raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, pushed the nation to the brink of civil war. Upholding his campaign promise not to run for re-election, after Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860, Buchanan reportedly told his successor, "If you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel on returning to Wheatland, his Lancaster, Pennsylvania estate, you are a happy man," making James Buchanan the last sitting president before a nation went to war with itself. The Tragedies of Mary and Abraham Lincoln. Prior to the November 4, 1842 marriage of Mary and Abe Lincoln, historians have unearthed strong evidence of Abraham's persistent depression and suicidal thoughts, made worse after the tragic death of his first love, Anna Mays Rutledge, in August of 1835, leading a one-time neighbor and friend, Mentor Graham, to confess that Lincoln told me that he felt like committing suicide often. Lincoln suffered a second major depression in 1841 after he broke off his engagement to Mary because of his affection for another woman, prompting friends and relatives to remove guns and knives from Lincoln's home. Following their marriage, a devoted Lincoln watched helplessly as his wife developed illnesses and erratic behaviors, made worse by the death of their 11-year-old son Willie to typhoid fever in 1862, followed by an 1863 head injury caused by a carriage accident that left her complaining of migraines. As the Civil War slogged on, President Lincoln's depression worsened over the weight of his office and the heavy death toll taking place on American battlefields, while Mary's worsened under the continuous death threats heaped upon her husband by pro-slavery Southerners, who also labeled Mary a traitor to her own Southern roots. As for the president, historians now point to Marfan syndrome as the cause of his depression, which is an inherited genetic disorder that weakens the connective papillary tendons and muscles in the valves of the human heart, a condition frequently associated with depression. After Lincoln's assassination, Mary's psychotic behavior worsened dramatically, further exacerbated 6 years later when on July 15, 1871, her fourth son Tad died at 18 years of age, with the cause of death variously blamed on tuberculosis, pneumonia, or congestive heart failure. The loss sent Mary off the deep end as she combed the United States, Canada, and Europe for spiritualists in hope of communicating with her lost loved ones. As her mental health worsened, her eldest son Robert petitioned the courts until his mother was admitted against her will into Bellevue Place Sanitarium in Batavia, Illinois. After 2 suicide attempts at Bellevue, Mary was released into the custody of her sister Elizabeth in Springfield, Illinois, where she passed away from a stroke on July 16, 1882, at 63 years of age, making the tragedies of Mary and Abe Lincoln a latent testament to the pressures of their time. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln. On April 9, 1865, after 4 years of bloody warfare that cost the lives of 620,000 Americans, Confederate General-in-Chief Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia officially surrendered to the Union Army of the Potomac under the commanding general of the United States. The surrender took place at the McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, after one of the final battles of the Civil War. Less than a week later, the American nation would shudder at the loss of one of its most historic and impactful leaders. On April 14, 1865, after a long day tending to the nation's business, the 16th American president and his wife Mary went to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. to take in the wildly popular stage play comedy, Our American Cousin. Due to his national fame as a stage actor, Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth maintained ready access to all parts of Ford's Theater, using his carte blanche access for the planned assassination of President Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William H. Seward. While Booth's co-conspirator Lewis Powell was tasked with killing Seward, George Atzerodt was tasked with killing the vice president. Arriving late to the theater with Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, the play was interrupted so that the orchestra could play Hail to the Chief as the packed house of some 1,700 theatergoers rose in applause. As the play resumed, Booth, who knew the play by heart, entered the Lincoln skybox from behind, timing his lone shot to coincide with one of the funniest lines of the play. As laughter pealed throughout the theater, Booth approached the president and shot him in the back of the head with a 6-inch single-shot Derringer. The bullet entered Lincoln's skull behind his left ear, passed through his brain, and came to rest near the front of his skull, fracturing both his orbital plates. Major Rathbone jumped from his seat and struggled with Booth, who dropped his Derringer and drew a knife, stabbing Rathbone in his left forearm. Rathbone again grabbed at Booth just as the assassin jumped from the skybox to the stage. A 12-foot drop, but not before one of his spurs became entangled with the Treasury flag decorating the Lincoln skybox. Booth's fall to the stage was a painful one, landing him awkwardly on his left foot, but as he began to cross the stage, many in the audience thought he was part of the play and began to laugh. Before Booth fled into the night, most eyewitness accounts indicate that Booth held up his bloody knife and yelled "Sic semper tyrannis," which is Latin for "thus always to tyrants." With the help of 3 doctors in attendance that night, the comatose president was moved across the street to a first-floor bedroom in Taylor William Peterson's house. More physicians arrived to offer aid, but the 16th President of the United States left this earth the following day at 7:22 in the morning. Lincoln's death was mourned around the world. Hundreds of thousands attended his funeral procession through the streets of Washington, D.C. on April 19th, followed by a 1,700-mile train ride procession from New York to Lincoln's hometown of Springfield, Illinois, often passing trackside tributes in the form of bands, bonfires, and hymn singing. The hunt for the conspirators quickly became the largest in U.S. history, involving thousands of federal troops and countless civilians. Booth was cornered by the 16th New York Cavalry while the assassin was sleeping in a barn in Virginia. A lone soldier snuck up behind him and shot Booth in the back of the head, a just reprisal for what the assassin had done to the President of the United States. Many of Booth's co-conspirators were freed after lengthy trials, while Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt were hanged by the neck on June 30th, 1865. Ulysses S. Grant. Born in 1822 Ohio, Ulysses S. Grant graduated 21st in his class from West Point. serving with distinction during the Mexican-American War. In 1848, he married Julia Dent, and after the birth of their 4 children, in 1854, Grant resigned his commission to live in relative poverty with his family. He re-enlisted after the Civil War broke out in 1861, rising to prominence after several early Union victories in the Western Theater. In 1863, he led the Vicksburg Campaign, which gained control of the Mississippi River, followed by the Chattanooga Campaign, which led to his promotion to Lieutenant General by President Abraham Lincoln. Over the next 13 months, Grant fought Confederate General Robert E. Lee during the high-casualty Overland Campaign and at Petersburg. And when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, 1 week later, President Lincoln was assassinated by famed stage actor John Wilkes Booth at Washington's Ford's Theater. When Andrew Johnson succeeded Lincoln into the White House, he promoted Grant to General of the Army in 1866. After openly departing with Johnson over the president's hands-off enforcement of the Reconstruction Acts, designed to improve civil rights for freed African Americans, Grant's status as a Civil War hero propelled him into the White House in 1868, where he stabilized the nation's post-war economy, supported ratification of the 15th Amendment, while prosecuting the Ku Klux Klan. In 1871, Grant formed the Civil Service Commission, which was created to select employees for federal jobs on merit rather than political relationships. In the presidential election of 1872, liberal Republicans and Democrats united behind Grant against presidential candidate Horace Greeley, winning re-election to a second term in office. During his final term, Grant would oversee the Great Sioux War, while his foreign policy saw the peaceful resolution of the Alabama claims against Great Britain, although his attempted annexation of his prized Dominican Republic were rejected by the Senate. In his retirement, Grant was the first president to circumnavigate the world, where he dined with Queen Victoria and met many prominent foreign leaders. After his failed 1880 bid to obtain the Republican presidential nomination for a third term in office, Grant suffered a string of severe financial reversals, and after his diagnosis of throat cancer, he wrote his memoir less than a month before his death in July of 1885, which proved to be a major critical and financial success, enjoyed solely by his beloved Julia. Grover Cleveland. Born in 1837 Caldwell, New Jersey, Grover Cleveland dropped out of school at 16 after his father died in 1853, working as a teacher for the New York Institute for the Blind to help support his 8 brothers and sisters. Passing the New York bar exam in 1859, without attending law school, Cleveland opened his own law firm in 1862, avoiding conscription into the Civil War by paying a Polish immigrant to serve in his place. Elected sheriff of Erie County, New York in 1871, a decade later he became mayor of Buffalo, New York in 1882, followed by his election as New York State Governor in 1883 due to his growing reputation as an anti-corruption politician, which soon put him at odds with the powerful Tammany Hall political machine in New York City. Despite a paternity scandal where he admittedly paid child support to a woman who claimed he was the father of her child, Cleveland won the White House in 1884 with the support of crossover Republican mugwumps. Cleveland based his political appointments on merit rather than party affiliation, using his presidential veto power 414 times during his first term, more times than all preceding U.S. presidents combined, in an attempt to curb government spending at the federal level. Marrying 21-year-old Frances Folsom at a White House ceremony in 1886, 27 years as junior and the youngest First Lady in U.S. history, Cleveland lost his bid for a second term to Republican Benjamin Harrison, largely due to Cleveland's persistent fight to lower or eliminate protective tariffs on foreign imports. Winning the Democratic presidential nomination and later the White House in 1892, the only U.S. president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, despite his reputation as a political reformer, his lackluster and almost bewildered response to the Panic of 1893 angered his original supporters. When the U.S. economy was crippled by a string of railroad and bank failures, a stock market crash, transportation strikes, a nationwide credit crisis, and skyrocketing unemployment that peaked at 19%. Declining the run for a 3rd term, Cleveland retired to his estate in Princeton, New Jersey, serving as a trustee of Princeton University until his death by heart attack on June 24, 1908, where he uttered on his deathbed, "I have tried so hard to do right," making the life and achievements of Grover Cleveland a guiding influence in late 19th century American politics.